Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. In our last video, we began looking at that period between the Old and the New Testament, often called the 400 years of silence, because from the time of the last prophet Malachi in 430 BC, there was no inspired messenger from God until John the Baptist appeared, who would prepare the way for Jesus. And although there was no inspired writer during this period, we had mentioned when we had done a study of the prophets that God, through his prophet Daniel, who prophesied during the Babylonian captivity and continuing on to the time of the Persian kings, that God had revealed to Daniel what would happen from this time of captivity, time of restoration, through this 400 years period, clear to the time of Christ. In our last video, we looked at a dream that's recorded for us in Daniel chapter 2, where there Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had dreamed about this great image. Its head was of gold, its arms were of silver, its belly of bronze, its legs of iron, and his feet iron and clay. And then he saw a stone that was cut out without a hand that struck that image on the feet and break it into pieces, and it became like chaff, and the wind carried the chaff away, but the stone that had struck the image on the feet grew into a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And although none of the wise men of Babylon could interpret that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, God revealed to Daniel. And in turn, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that no man is able to interpret your dream, but there is a God in heaven. And he told Daniel that his dream represented the fact that there were going to be 4 great earthly empires to rule the world from the time of Babylon to the time of Christ. Because he told Nebuchadnezzar that he was the head of gold. He said, after you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours, another third kingdom that will rule the earth, and then a 4th kingdom. And then he predicted that in the days of those kings, the God of heaven would set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed. So God told Nebuchadnezzar through the prophet Daniel that there's going to be 4 greater empires to rule the world from the time of Daniel. That was Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then he predicted that in the days of the Roman Empire that the God of heaven would set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed. And of course that was fulfilled when Jesus came and established his church, which is of course a spiritual kingdom, as Jesus told Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. And so what we want to do today is to look at some more dreams and visions that occurred in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters are very easy to understand. They're pretty straightforward, historical. But the last 6 chapters are kind of like the Revelation, because they're written in signs and symbols. They're a lot of misunderstanding about these books, but they're like the Revelation itself. It's not that difficult if you just let the Bible interpret the Bible. And what we need to do is just look at it and try not to read too much into it. Pay attention not only to what is said, but also what is not said. And another important thing to realize that these visions in Daniel are also like the Revelation. They're not necessarily in chronological order. A lot of times, we think of things we want to be the beginning, middle, and end. But like in the Revelation, we see things that are cyclical. They go in cycles. Well, that's the same thing in the book of Daniel, that these visions that we see and are often, they stand alone. And many times something that's going to happen later on is recorded first, and then something earlier is recorded second. So when you look at them, these dreams individual, you'll see what I mean. Because there's another dream that Daniel has in chapter 7 that's actually a parallel to what he saw in Daniel chapter 2. Because in Daniel chapter 2, he saw that great image with the head of gold, silver, brass, and iron and clay. that represented 4 earthly empires. Well, in chapter 7, it says that he's going to stand on the seashore and he's going to see 4 beasts coming out of the sea. He's going to see a lion, he's going to see a bear, a leopard, and a dreadful and terrible beast. But these are the exact parallel to what we saw in Daniel chapter 2, because just as he saw the gold, silver, brass, and iron that represented Babylon, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, the same thing. These beasts out of the sea, the lion represents Babylon, the bear represents Medo-Persia, the leopard's going to represent the empire of the Greeks, and the dreadful and terrible beast is going to be the Roman Empire. So it's kind of a confirmation of what we already saw, that between the time of captivity to the time of Christ, there's going to be these 4 great empires to rule the world. But the importance is not these earthly empires, but it's what happens after. Just like God had said that in the days of the Roman Empire, then God set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed. Well, in the same way, he sees the God's kingdom in a heavenly vision. This is, to me, one of the most fascinating passages in the Bible, because we know in the New Testament that when Jesus gave the Great Commission to his disciples and told them to go in all the world and preach the gospel, and then ascended back to heaven, in the book of Acts, chapter 1, there we see that Jesus, after he gave the commission to his disciples, that he stood there and they watched, and Jesus ascended up, and it said a cloud received him out of their sight. Well, in Daniel chapter 7, we actually see what takes place on the other side of the clouds. Because after he talks about these 4 beasts that come out of the sea, he then has this heavenly vision, and he says this. He said, I saw one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days. Now that's very important, because we know that in the time of the judgment that Christ is going to come in the clouds. He's going to come to earth. But this time he said that he was in the clouds, he was going to the Ancient of Days. That is, he was going to God the Father in heaven. So what appears in Daniel chapter 7 is a continuation. What the apostles saw in Acts 2 when they saw Jesus in that cloud. See, God, through his revelation, lets us see what took place on the other side. And it said that in this vision, Jesus comes to God the Father, and it says, then there was given to him glory and power and a dominion and a kingdom that all nations should serve him. And so that's exactly what the same thing as what we read in Acts chapter 2, that in the days of these kings, God will set up his kingdom that will never be destroyed. So those are 2 important visions in the book of Daniel, but there's another that appears in Daniel chapter 8. And this is the vision about the ram and the male goat. Now, in this vision, he sees this ram that's pushing northward or westward and northward and southward, and it had 2 horns, but one horn was higher than the other. Well, that's a clear description of the Medes and Persians. And in case you think that I'm being presumptuous on this interpretation, just take a look in the book of Daniel chapter 8. It actually mentions the Medes and Persian, and also the kingdom of Greece. Because the male goat that then is going to attack this ram is represented of the Greek Empire. And it's interesting, like in the vision of the 4 beasts that came out of the sea, the Greeks are represented as a leopard. That is something small and swift. And that is so accurate, because where the Persians had a large, powerful army, the Greeks were able to defeat them with a small, swift army. Well, in the same way, in this vision in Daniel chapter 8, you see the Medes and Persians represented by this ram that had 2 horns. One raised up, one was higher. That's because the Persians were a more prominent influence than the Medes. At first it was known as the Medo-Persian Empire, later it was just known as the Persian Empire. Well, in the same way, when we see the male goat, it said that this male goat was coming from the west without touching the ground. And again, it's a great representation of Alexander, who with a small, swift army was able to defeat the mighty Persian Empire. But here's the most fascinating part of this vision, because we had the ram with the two horns representing the Medes and Persian. Here, this male goat, it said it had a notable horn on its head. And after it defeated the ram, it said the horn was broken and that 4 horns came up in its place. Well, that's such an accurate description of what happened in history, because we know that Alexander, that after conquering the Persian Empire, that on the way, after they had gone to what they thought was the end of the earth, to the borders of India, his men rebelled, and so they didn't want to go any further, so they turned around and were heading back to the west. And in Babylon, that Alexander caught a fever and died. And when he died, his kingdom was divided up among his 4 generals. You had the Ptolemies ruling Egypt, the Seleucid rulers ruling Syria, and you had Lysimachus and Cassander that took the homeland, that is Asia Minor and Greece. But the 2 most prominent kings, as far as the Bible record is concerned, are these Ptolemies and these Seleucid rulers, because they're the ones that are going to, throughout history, then control the land of Palestine. If you look on a map of the biblical area, when the Seleucid rulers rule in what's modern day Iran and here Turkey, at times they're going to have control over Palestine, and you're going to have the Ptolemies here in Egypt, and then at times the Ptolemies here in Egypt, that they're going to have control. So, and these are the ones that are going to be referred to throughout the book of Daniel when he talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. He's talking about the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucid rulers in Syria. And so these are going to be Greek rulers that are going to control this area. And that reminds me of a mistake, though, I made in my last video when I was talking about Cleopatra, because she was, of course, one of the queens in Egypt, and I said that she was descendants of the Syrians, and I meant that she was descendants of the Greeks, because these people that are going to rule Syria, the Seleucid rulers, and Ptolemies are all going to be Greeks. Some of Alexander's generals are going to take over after his death. Now, another interesting thing we want to look at just very shortly before we close this study, and that is that in these visions that occur in Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8, we have 2 little horns that represent periods of persecution of God's people. Now, the little horn that's mentioned in Daniel chapter 8 is one of those Seleucid rulers, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who greatly oppressed God's people. And the little horn that's mentioned earlier in chapter 7 actually represent the oppression of God's people under Rome. And so this is another good example where you have things not in order, because in chapter 7 you have the Roman oppression of God's people, and it's actually recorded in chapter 7 where the oppression of God's people under these Syrian rulers, those Seleucid rulers, is recorded in chapter 7. And these are things, we'll be looking at these in detail in a little future videos. I know this is a lot of information. This is definitely the meat of the word, but I hope this has been beneficial and that you'll tune in again. Thanks.